Termo to Madeline, audio edition, page 245, chapter titled Homestead on Sage Hen Flat. Now, if there was not much to be done in the way of farming on the flat below Madeline, there was even less that could be done at Sage Hen. But there were those who tried. Jack Thorpe had a homestead there. A young lady by the name of Cara Craft had a homestead there. Her sister Goldie and her brother also lived there with her. Andy Cassell had a homestead on the Sage Hen. His wife was dead, but he had 5 children who lived with him: Bessie, Albert, Arthur, and one other son and daughter. They did not live at Sage Hen, however. Instead, they stayed in the living quarters on the north end of the livery barn in Madeline. About 1914, Mr. Cassell built a couple of huge cement oil dumps for the NCO next to their water tank. Next chapter titled Mormon Farmers from Utah. The Polsons were the first Utah farmers to come to Madeline. Pete and his brother Joe were farmers and dealers in real estate. They formed a partnership with Wilson Bailey in 1909. They ran the ranch for him and had an option to buy it. They moved in and Wilson Bailey moved out, taking his family to Oakland. The Polsons were probably the first real farmers to come to Madeline. Over the years, they raised beautiful crops of hay and grain in that place. They harvested their grain with a horse-drawn combine and sold it by their hay, which was put up in huge loose stacks and was fed to their livestock. With the place came the first and best water right, so the Polsons never wanted for irrigation water. They lived and worked on the Bailey place until the late 20s, when the Great Depression started. At that time, they were within only a few $1,000s of having Wilson Bailey paid off. But they missed a payment due to hard times, and Wilson foreclosed. Pete and his wife Tilly had 6 children when they moved to Madeline: Owen, Leon, Clyde, Maud, Edna, and Minnie. Donald and Richard were born while they were living at Madeline. Joe Paulson was not married when they came, but later married Amber Olson. The Olsons were another Mormon family from Manti, Utah, that settled in Madeline. James and Anna had 5 children upon their arrival in Madeline: Amber, Hilda, Devon, Carl, and Glenn. 2 other sons, James and Gilbert, had died as babies before they ever left Utah. A 6th son, Rex, was born at Madeline. The Olsons came in 1910 as far as Amity. James and Devon drove all their supplies up to Madeline from there with a team and wagon. But Mrs. Olson and the other children rode up on the NCO. They first took up a homestead 3 miles southwest of Madeline on the proposed irrigation system. They cleared it and planted it to oats. The oats came up beautifully in the spring, but the jackrabbits mowed the crop of clean. Discouraged with that experience, James bought out Abe Tiblet and moved his family onto that place. Previously, they had been living in Brock Acres' house. Now, once the family was settled on the Triplet place, James traded the 320-acre homestead on the flat for a water right on his new place. Over the years, the Olsons leased the Triplet place out a time or 2. They lost their water right when the irrigation company collapsed and had to buy a new one. But through hard times and lean years, they hung on, and their descendants still own it today. The Lundgrens were from Richfield, Utah, as were the Polsons. They also came to Madeline in 1910. Charles and Georgina had 3 children: Ruth, Ralph, and Roddy. Then Mr. Lundgren had 2 sons by a previous marriage: Adolph and Imal. The Lundgren family bought out a previous homesteader by the name of Young. The place was against the hill south of Madeline. Like all the other homesteaders, the Lundgrens tried to farm, but had no great success, as they were strictly dry farming. They tried a procedure that seemed to be common in the time for obtaining water. Willis Brockman and Daniel Rogers had drilled into the hills in back of their respective places to obtain water. The Lundgrens also tunneled into the mountain in back of their place. None of the attempts to find water in this fashion bore any fruit. Mr. Lundgren, a huge man, died in Madeline. His remains were shipped back to Richfield, Utah, but the family stayed at Madeline for a while. There were 2 other settlers involved in the Mormon settlement at Madeline, although they were not necessarily Mormons themselves. Cy Hellman homesteaded a piece of ground on the Clarks Valley Road above the Paulsons, which he sold to them as soon as he proved up on it. They built a shearing corral, set up lambing barns, and a dripping trench for sheep. Then the Paulsons rented it to the various sheepmen to use. Cy Hellman worked as a blacksmith for the busy Paulson operation over the years. He also held the job of night holster on the NCO for several years. He was a bachelor, but finally married Gertrude Callahan, Molly Brockman's sister. Now, Ike Stewart was not a Mormon, but his wife Nora was. She was also a Paulson. The Stewarts were also from Richfield, Utah. Ike was in partners with Paulson over the years and at times managed to ranch for them. He also contracted haying in Likely. There was one other Mormon family that came to Madeline with the Paulsons, Joe and Emma Zolig, and their 5 daughters, Nettie, Edna, Lita, Nellie, and Mildred. Joe spent some time working on the canals for the irrigation project, but then he moved his family out to Red Rock. He took up a homestead there, but spent those years working on the Moulton Ranch. Later, in the early 30s, the Zoligs came back to Madeline and Joe and Emma operated The Tavern, Madeline's second hotel, which was owned by the Fritz family. Next chapter, titled Brockman Settlers. Brockman was originally a siding on the railroad located just below the Brockman Ranch buildings and a little to the north. There was a small resaw mill there for a while. Rough lumber was shipped in, sawed to size, and shipped out. Then in 1909, application was made for a post office at Brockman's. Permission was granted in 1910, and Molly Brockman became the new postmistress. The Brockmans built a small structure on the property to house the new post office. All of the land between Termo and Madeline, and from Mount McDonald on the east to the hills on the west side, became known as Brockman. It was all under the proposed irrigation scheme, and hundreds of hours were spent in building canals and lateral ditches to cover the area. Homesteaders came in droves, and most of them worked on the ditches for the Cana Costa Construction Company, the outfit that had contracted with Jones to do the actual building. Willis Brockman provided most of the horses for the project. Many of the homesteaders were inexperienced horsemen, however, and they weaned a lot of those horses. Willis could cure the problem, but it took time and a lot of care. So he never got rich renting his horses to the construction company. Willis also provided room and board for the company's bookkeeper. He stayed in the Brockmans' bunkhouse, maintaining a long row of candles on a table so that he could work on the books at night. Frank and Bill Davidson were 2 young brothers from Lerwich, a town in the Shetland Islands of Scotland. Bill, the older of the 2, came to the Madeline Plains first. He had come the long way around from Scotland, having lived in New Zealand and British Columbia in Canada prior to his arrival at Brockman. Both boys had worked in the fishing and shipping industries of their native land before immigrating. Frank arrived at Brockman in 1914 at the age of 21. He left a bride and a 6-month-old daughter behind in the old country. He had intentions of bringing them to the country as soon as he could earn their fare. But World War I broke out in Europe a few months after his arrival here, and his homeland shut down all immigration. He built a small 2-room cabin next to Bill's 1-room cabin and settled down to wait out the war. Both boys filed on 160 acres, but only did enough work on the land to prove up on it. The rest of their time was spent in buckarooing and working for Willis Brockman. Daddy Fraser was a well-known homesteader at Brockman, not for any superior farming ability, but because he played the fiddle. was a junk dealer and was an old man with a white beard. He was a widower who had a couple of sons of his own, but he was Daddy Fraser to everyone at Brockman. His two sons also homesteaded at the Brockmans, but were only there a short while. Andrew Feliciano owned one of the two steam-powered traction engines at Brockman. The irrigation company had originally owned it, but Mr. Feliciano bought their interest in it. It was used all over the west side in clearing brush and plowing and harvesting. William and Mary Hintz, of the Bill Keeper family, Curly Lavelle, Frank and Inez Long, and their son Andy, and John Lassen, all had places at Brockman. Frank and Pansy Lane and their son Lawrence also had a homestead at Brockman. Frank Lane was a sheepman, so the family usually moved to lower country during the winters. Bert Musgrove and his wife lived first at Madeline in a bunkhouse on the west side of town. Later he homesteaded at Brockman, but mostly he buckarooed for ranchers in the area. Now, Ross and Nora Maurer had a homestead between the Van Loan place and Brockman that they had taken up in 1910. At the time they filed on the homestead, they had two daughters, Loretta and Mary. Two more daughters were born on the homestead, Bertha and Amelia. Later, in 1918, their only son, Oliver Roscoe, was born. Ross had also leased the Van Loan Ranch since 1906, and he continued to do so until it sold in 1919. He followed the pattern set by Elmer Van Loan in raising purebred Shire draft horses. He milked a few dairy cows and ran beef cattle. The range cattle were generally wintered at Likely. During the winters, the family usually lived in Madeline. In the summer, they lived on the homestead or at the Van Loan place. There were other native sons besides Ross who homesteaded in the area. These were the sons of Ike and Mary Metcalf, George, Levi, Carl, and Otis. Mostly they took up land in Dry Valley, but they lived on both sides of Dry Valley Ridge. Like many of the homesteaders, they milked a few cows and sold the cream, shipping it out on the NCO. Dan and Jane Rogers took up a homestead on the west side, bordering the Whittinger place on the north. Their son Daniel C. and his wife Julia also lived there for several years. Their other two sons, Walter and Oliver, also lived there and worked around the country. Walter took over the job of postmaster at the Brockman Post Office in 1917, after the death of Molly Brockman. The Rogers also had two unmarried daughters who lived at Brockman with them, Viola and Blanche. During those years, they also had one married daughter, Louise, who came with her husband, Clint Olch, to live at Brockman also. Dan was a carpenter. When times were lean in farming, he found plenty of work around the country, building various structures for various people. The Smith boys were some more of the native sons who settled at Brockman. Actually, Grover was the only one who took up a homestead. His place was on the east side of 9 Mile Point. Tom worked as an engineer on the NCO, but helped out on the homestead during whatever free time he had. Earl lived around the country of Madeline, Brockman, and Termo. But he did not take up any land of his own. He leased various places. Over the years, buckarooed and worked out at whatever work there was. Glenn Talbot was a brother of Pearl Talbot of Madeline. He and his wife Naomi came to Brockman in 1912, shortly after they married. They built a house and corrals and fenced their property, which was situated between Brockman and Termo. They lived there several years, but later bought out Calvin Mitchell east of Madeline. When Talbots owned the place, they farmed the entire piece. They also bought Carrie Craft's place on Sage Hen. They leased the Jim Olson place for a while his family was in Gridley working on the rice fields. Finally, in 1921, they bought the Pino place from Mrs. Pino, who, by that time, was a widow. During the 3 years they leased the Olson place, the Olson's oldest son, Devon, was their permanent hired hand. Glenn and Naomi became the parents of 3 children during their years at the Madeline: Norman, Harold, and Nadine. Clint and Louise Olch arrived in 1910 and took up a homestead in the flat just a mile and a half due west of Brockman. They had 2 sons, Rod and Claire, when they came to the Madeline Plains. Millard, Jane, and Dan were born right there on the homestead. It was on an irrigation ditch, but they never saw any water. Clint was a horseman, and although he and his family lived on their homestead, he spent the next 18 years breaking horses for Willis Brockman. Mostly he broke horses to drive. He also operated an 18-horse jerkline, pulling enormous excavator when Willis was county supervisor. Roads and canals and levees were built all over that end of the plains by the Clint Olch. Later, when the Rogers family left the plains, Clint moved his family to their house. Over the years, he also leased John Lassen's and Arthur Weaver's place when they left the country. Clint Olch also leased the Whittinger place and the Anderson place for a year or 2. Frederick and May Webb had the distinction of having what was probably the fanciest house of all the homesteaders on the Madeline Plains. It was located just over a mile due west of Brockman. It was painted and had frills that the average homesteader home simply did not have. One feature was an elaborate, ornamentally decorated winding staircase. At any rate, the Webbers were on the proposed irrigation scheme. They had come to Brockman in 1907, earlier than the average homesteader. The Weaver family arrived on the plains in 1914. Arthur Weaver had bought the relinquishment for a homestead from an already discouraged homesteader. Of course, the man had bragged it up to Mr. Weaver, so he loaded his wife Estella and their 2 sons, George and Ray, on the train at Sacramento and headed for Madeline. When they arrived, Pearl Talbot met them at the station and offered to take them out to the homestead, which he did the next day. Their place bordered Rogers on the west side of the plains just north of the Whittinger place. It already had a board and batten house, which the family moved into. Like all the homesteaders, they went to work clearing the 20 acres relinquished to prove up on the homestead. George was 16 and went to work for Pearl Talbot to prove a little cash for the family. Many years later, his younger brother Ray would marry the Talbot's daughter, Elsie. At any rate, Arthur Weaver had an insight that few of the homesteaders had. He was a railroad man and had not been involved in farming since he was a young man. But he had seen a similar irrigation scheme to the Madeline Meadows project fail miserably in Wyoming several years before. He was sure the company would fold and refuse to sign up for any water. 2 other homesteaders to take up land at the Brockman and on the west side were 2 local boys, Lewis and Clarence Whittinger. They took up land next to their parents' place and added the Whittinger operation, making the family holdings one of the largest dry land setups on the plains. Next chapter, titled Iowa Farmers. Because of the irrigation company's extensive advertising campaign in the Midwest, there were several farmers that came to the Madeline Plains from Iowa. There were a few people, such as the Fitz family, who heard of the plains after coming west from Iowa. The company organized several excursions from Nebraska and Iowa to bring farmers out to see the Madeline Meadows. So there were those who came as a direct response to the advertisements. The first farmers from Iowa that took up property came in a group from Ankeny, Iowa, in March of 1911. There were the Adamson family, Charles and Ruth and their 6 children, Orpha, Jenny, Harlan, Bob, Lester, and Olive. Ruth Adamson's brother, Walter Cox, brought his wife Martha and their children Albert, Alden, and Glendowen. And there was a single man that came with them by the name of Harry Cornwell. He later married Orpha Adamson, and the entire group became one family. The group came west in immigrant cars on the Northwestern Railroad. All the horses and farm equipment and furniture were loaded onto boxcars. The men rode in these boxcars to care for the animals, and the women and children rode in the passenger train. Upon arrival at Madeline, the group all filed on homesteads on the west side of Brockman. Harry Cornwell's piece of land already had a cabin on it, and they had built by a previous homesteader who had already given up and gone. The other two families immediately set about building their homes and clearing their land to plant to hay and grain. Harry got a job as ditch tender for the irrigation company. He had to see that all the ditches were kept in good condition and open the head gates when people were ready for water. George and Anna Philman came out to Brockman that same spring in 1911 from Des Moines, Iowa. Mrs. Philman's son, Bill Stretter, came with him and also took up a homestead on the west side, as did the two Philman sons, Roscoe and Wes. Allie and Beatrice Smith of Dexter, Iowa, also came to Brockman that spring. They took up a homestead in the middle of the flat between the Lanes and the Olches. Allie bought an Avery steam engine and threshing machine. He brought it with him in an immigrant car when he came. He hired out with his tractor and threshing machine all around the area and eventually took a job as engineer on the NCO. The interesting thing about these farmers from Iowa is that they were just that, farmers, and they were good ones. Like the Polsons, they had been making their living from farming for many years, and the fact that they were convinced that the irrigation system would work has to take some of the burden of its failure off of the promoters. Next chapter, titled The Finlanders, page 254.